I am one of 9 children, and growing up, our family was so busy just trying to survive. We never stopped to take the time to realize that we were poor. And one of the ways we were able to survive was picking potatoes. We lived in this house that was surrounded by a potato farm, and every year the farmer would harvest his field. He'd let people come and pick up what was left behind, as long as you asked permission. Well, my father had no problem asking permission, so we Bigoses would be out in the fields picking potatoes and potatoes and potatoes. And I always remember gathering the potatoes, digging my hands in the soil, filling burlap sacks, hauling them to our basement, and we'd gather enough potatoes to last well into the next year. I remember learning to look for a stem, because sometimes it was just a piece of stem, but other times it was connected to 1, 2, or even 3 good-sized potatoes. I felt like I was treasure hunting the whole time. Now, this experience changed me and taught me many important lessons, but I also discovered a phenomenon that shaped my perspective and my posture going forward from that day. And that phenomenon is, where you have a fertile or a productive field, you will have leftovers. And those leftovers will either be waste or they'll be opportunity. Now, the farmer couldn't gather up the leftover potatoes. It would have cost him too much. It would have been inefficient. He had to get his harvest to market. He needed to maintain his equipment. He needed to run his farm. For the farmer to do what he needed to do, he had to leave something behind. Was it waste or was it opportunity? Well, my father saw opportunity. He taught us not to be afraid to get our hands dirty and to work hard, and there a value was born, that with vision and hard work, waste is actually an opportunity. Now, I'd like to share with you today one such opportunity that I've been dedicated to for the past 7 years. Before this time, I was working for a manufacturer who produces components for the automotive, industrial, and aerospace industries. It's a very high-tech, forward-thinking organization that really prides itself on excellence. And one day I was approached by my boss at the time, and he basically said, "Woody, metal chips and fluids are a mess. There has to be a better way. Go figure it out." So I did. I went to bed one night with an idea, and I woke up the next morning and I was an entrepreneur, but I didn't know it. I've heard it said that an entrepreneur is someone who will gladly work 16 hours a day to avoid working 8 hours a day for someone else. There's a lot of truth in that. So I discovered something very shocking along the way, and that is that millions and millions of gallons of these metalworking fluids are disposed of every year. More than 90% of what's produced is thrown away. This is not sustainable. I can see a day when no manufacturer would even think of throwing away these fluids, and the recool process was born from that dream. Recool is my process to reclaim and reprocess these fluids so they can be used over and over again. Simply put, we separate, we reuse, and we repeat the process. If you drill down to our core, what we're truly about is sustainability, meaning that we're not going to use tomorrow's resources to meet today's needs. But as accepted as the concept of sustainability seems to be today, there are some major barriers to sustainability. I think most people would recognize the first major barrier, which is the economic barrier. You can have a sustainable solution, but if it fails to be economically viable, it ultimately won't succeed. The second major barrier I like to refer to as the convenience barrier. If you have a sustainable solution that is either inconvenient or even perceived to be inconvenient, people will actually go out of their way to avoid it, and it will ultimately fail. So the bad news is the space to innovate between these barriers is very narrow. But the good news is the path actually becomes very clear and very direct. These 3 words are associated with each other. Gasoline was poured into rivers in the late 1800s when kerosene was the dominant fuel. Lobster was used by Native Americans as fertilizer. It was fed to slaves and prisoners, and in fact, indentured servants coming to America would have it written into their contracts that you cannot force me to eat lobster more than twice a week. Oh, how things have changed. So my question is, what is waste? Because all three of these items at one time were considered throwaway or waste items. Let's start with the definition. Waste is an act or an instance of using or expending something carelessly, extravagantly, or to no purpose. George Washington Carver has a very famous, eloquent quote which points to the fact that nature produces no waste. The end of one cycle is the beginning of another cycle. So, imagine if you could find value in waste. Or imagine if you could put that value to a purpose. Or imagine if alternatives could be used and eliminate the waste to begin with. Is it possible? Well, let's take a trip back in time. The year is 1913. By the close of the year, the Ford Motor Company would have produced more than 400,000 of its Model T Ford, which revolutionized the world as we knew it. They'd also institute their first moving assembly line, which would accelerate production to more than 15 million Model Ts by the close of 1928. 15 million Model T Fords meant 60 million wooden spoke wheels. 60 million wooden spoke wheels meant an enormous pile of scrap wood. So what did Henry Ford do? Henry Ford developed the Ford charcoal briquette. It wasn't uncommon to have a bag thrown in with the sale of a Model T. Now, we recognize this today as the Kingsford Charcoal Company, which almost topped $400 million in sales last year of a nearly $800 million industry. But this is what fascinates me about the Kingsford story. They still hold similar values today. I'm pretty sure none of us saw very many wooden spoke wheels driving in here today. Kingsford built a charcoal plant in the middle of a furniture manufacturing hub. The furniture manufacturers had a problem, getting rid of their wood waste. Kingsford saw opportunity. Kingsford charges them a nominal tipping fee. The furniture manufacturers save money, the wood stays out of the landfills, and Kingsford gets a revenue-positive raw material stream. Waste turned into opportunity, taking ordinary items and turning them into gold. We need to stop seeing waste and pivot our viewpoint so that we can see opportunities to achieve sustainability. So what does Recool do? Recool works with manufacturers who produce wet metal chips. If you manufacture metal parts, you're going to have as a byproduct these wet metal chips just saturated with this fluid. Most people don't realize how much fluid is captured in these chips and taken away with them to the recyclers. But you can see all the chips in this picture, but what you can't see is the countless microscopic particles that are coated with this as well. Now, we separate the fluid from the metal because the fluid is designed to stick to the surface of the metal so it can provide lubricity and other important factors to aid in the machining process. We separate this fluid from the metal. Now, if you took a 1 cubic foot block of aluminum, you would have 6 square feet of surface area. Simple geometry, 6 sides, 1 square foot a side. But if you took that same block of aluminum and you machined it into 50 micron size particles, which is about the size of a grain of salt, you would end up with more than 35,000 square feet of surface area. That's about the same living space as 14 homes. All of that surface area is coated with this metalworking fluid. It's getting taken away, out of sight, out of mind, to be blindly disposed of. Now, most machine operators never even consider this because they can't see it. But when I can pivot their viewpoint, I start to see the light turn on, and they're ready to come on board and make a change. Now, we separate the fluid from the metal, And the metal is compressed typically into these briquettes. These briquettes are sent to an appropriate mill, and they'll be melted down and cast. In this case, you're seeing some of our actual material that's been cast into raw form. This is aluminum. Can be returned back to the manufacturer as raw material. So the same product going out the back door as waste is coming through the front door as raw material. See, we're not taking a can, cutting the top off, and making it into a pencil holder. We're taking a can and reusing it as a can again and again. So what about the fluids? We separate the fluids by customer and by fluid type. We go through a reconditioning process which will return the product back to good as new. This is returned back to the original generator, clean and clear and ready to cut more parts. So what does this mean for the manufacturer? It means increased profitability for them. It means they can focus on their core business, and it means a vastly improved environmental impact. Now, somewhere along the way, I stumbled upon this concept: perspective, posture, and performance. I remember being young, my father told me, "Woody, you're Polish. You think backwards, upside down, and inside out. You don't say, how do we raise the bridge? You say, how do we lower the river?" And so for the longest time, I figured it was just normal to think that way, and it just required a little more brilliance to come up with solutions. But I'm convinced now that we as a culture have it all backwards. Everywhere I look, I see a focus on performance. How much money do you make? Where do you live? What's your GPA? It's all performance. But consider this. I actually think it works backwards. I think that everything pivots on your perspective. That is to say, how you view the world. Do you see a dirty potato field? Or do you see dinner? Do you see a big pile of scrap wood? Or do you see an $800 million industry? The lens you choose to look through will ultimately determine your posture or how you approach the challenges in your life, whether you face them head on or whether you shy away from them. Do you begin your efforts as a victim or a victor? Now, your perspective and your posture ultimately will determine your performance, at least any sustained performance. Look, anyone can get lucky once, but any sustainable performance that I've seen can be traced back to a very unique perspective. Now, when I started on my path to transform the metalworking fluid market, I knew we had a lot of work ahead of us. But any industry that wastes more than 90% of what it produces is ripe for change. And we've decided we're going to value forward thinking. We're going to value sustainability. And you know what? If you take a radical approach, you're going to have naysayers. But I'm seeing manufacturers welcome our approach, and they're thrilled about the gains in sustainability. Now, you know, I never grow tired of sharing our story. And it's amazing to have the opportunity to share it with all of you today. But it's even more amazing when I consider the fact that I was born with a cleft palate and a cleft lip. My mother told me stories about how I couldn't drink from a bottle, and she had to use a device similar to a turkey baster to feed me. And she told me about all the surgeries I had to endure. She was told I would have to go to speech therapy for years, which I did through the 5th grade. And I can remember avoiding conversations and even speaking because of the reaction that I was sure I would get. Now, my wife Heather would say I've gotten far, far past that, but you know, the set of challenges that I was given, there are people that have far greater sets of challenges. And I don't mean to suggest in any way that my set of challenges was any worse than any other person. But I do know this, that I experienced real physical pain. and I experienced real emotional pain. I experienced frustration, acts of cruelty and meanness, and I share that with you to make this point. I've learned that the real answers in your life, the breakthroughs that bring real change, they always flow from what you have, not what you don't have. They flow from where you are, not some far-off mystical place. And they flow from what you can do, not what you can't. If I know nothing else, I know this, that every single one of us here has limitations. I wonder what your limitations are. Are they physical limitations? Is it fear? Could it be your perspective? But this is also true, that nobody, past, present, or future, has what you have. You're that unique. If you need proof, just look at DNA. It proves just how unique we are. Only you can bring into a situation what you have. And the sum of your experiences, your talents, and your influence are of infinite value if they're applied to the situation that you find yourself in. Embrace that truth. Walk in the freedom of that truth, and you'll find that all sorts of amazing things are possible. Now, I'm a fan of Alison Krauss, and she was asked the question once, what was it like to work with producer T-Bone Burnett? Listen to her response. She said, you know, T-Bone has this amazing ability to keep his hands out of things and just let them happen. But when all is said and done, his fingerprints end up all over it. And I thought, what a wonderful way to capture the supremacy of influence versus the futility of control. Control can only last as long as your grip can hold. But influence can pass from generation to generation to generation. Now, I was told a long time ago by a friend about, in Greek culture, it's customary when a grandson is born that the grandfather will plant an olive tree. And the grandfather knows he'll never see olives off that tree. And his son may or may not see olives off that tree, but the grandson, he'll get the olives from that olive tree. What a wonderful way to think of how you can influence generations forward. Now, we all have the ability to, instead of leaving our footprint on the world, we can leave our fingerprints on the world. We can not only leave the world better than we found it, we can actually point it in a better direction. We can influence. So I encourage you to play with your perspective. Pivot your viewpoint. Try something new. Let your unique viewpoint illuminate opportunities that others walk past every day and influence the world in amazing ways. Thank you.